All right, we have a demonstration debate for you today. It's going to look a little different than the first demonstration debate. Our speakers are going to speak a little more quickly. The arguments are going to be specific to the camp topic, and you're going to see some things in this debate that you didn't observe in the first debate. On the affirmative, we have the 2007 and 2008 Glenbrooks champion, Jake Nebel. Let's give him a round of applause. On the negative, we have the 2009 Glenbrooks champion, Ben Lewis. Let's give him a round of applause. So this will determine the historical legacy of Glenbrooks for that 3-year period. So without further ado, AC Jake Nebel.
Is this loud enough? Everyone can hear me? Because addiction is a legitimate excuse, I affirm. Ought to note moral obligation, so I value morality. The affirmative's moral theory is contractualism, which T.M. Scanlon expresses as follows. An act is wrong if its performance under the circumstances would be disallowed by any set of principles for the general regulation of behavior that no one could reasonably reject as a basis for informed, unforced general agreement. I will argue that the criminal justice approach treats addicts in a way that they could not reasonably accept, and the public health approach restores addicts conditions of responsibility. R.J. Wallace explains 2 advantages of contractualism over consequentialism. First, contractualist reflection needs to take into account all the considerations that potentially provide people with a reasonable basis for objecting to candidate principles, and these include not only the effects of such principles on individual well-being, but also many other factors as well, including considerations of fairness, responsibility, choice, and so on. Many values are not well represented in the teleological terms recommended by consequentialism in states of affairs that it is our task as agents to promote. Second, the acceptability of principles made to depend on a one-by-one assessment of the strength of the reasons that individuals would have for rejecting the principle compared with the alternatives to it. This captures in a direct and attractive way a distinctive feature of ordinary moral thought and helps to render plausible the suggestion that contractualist procedures of reflection represent an appropriate response to the value of persons. Utilitarian approaches, by contrast, have always seemed problematic in this respect, since the emphasis they place on maximizing some allows weighty burdens on individuals to be justified by comparatively minor advantages to others, so long as those advantages accrue to a sufficiently large number of persons. Contractualism is the only moral theory that explains why we should be moral, because we have reason to do so and out of respect for other people's reasons. If contractualism is not true, then no moral theory could be true, because there would be no objective reasons that everyone could accept as reasons for acting. There would only be desires and mere tastes. Contractualism also offers the best explanation of the criminal justice system and our ordinary practices of holding people responsible. Gary Watson writes, "Duress exculpates because a person's fear expressed with rational and morally appropriate assessment of circumstances. The law often exculpates defendants in coercive situations out of respect for their reasons. The criminal law can be legitimate only if it is justifiable to those who are subject to its demands, and it can meet this condition only if its subjects have reason to comply. To punish him for circumstances of duress would be to treat the defendant in a way that could not be justified to him as a practical agent, would be to treat him on grounds that he could reasonably reject. Thus, the standard is tracking moral responsibility. If I prove that addicts are not morally responsible, then you should affirm, because the criminal justice approach treats addicts in a way that they could reasonably reject, rendering public health the best approach." Susan Wolf explains the requirements for moral responsibility. "In order to be free and responsible, we need not only be able to control our actions in accordance with our desires, we need to be able to control our desires in accordance with our deepest selves. We need, in other words, to be able to revise ourselves, to get rid of some desires and traits, and perhaps replace them with others on the basis of our deeper desires or values or reflections. However, consideration of the fact that the selves who are doing the revising might themselves be either brute products of external forces made us wonder whether the capacity for self-provision was still enough to assure us of responsibility. Still, if the ability to revise ourselves is not enough, the ability to create ourselves does not seem necessary either. Why would anyone be disappointed at having to accept the idea that one has to get one's start somewhere? What we do have reason to want then is something more than the ability to revise ourselves, but less than the ability to create ourselves. Implicit in the same deep self-view is the idea that what is needed is the ability to correct or improve ourselves. Tracking this capacity for sanity and self-correction is key to a utilitarian criminal justice system too. Robert Goodenough. "Punishment by a third party is typically not without cost. It often requires the altruistic bearing of cost without any direct material gain. It will be to the punisher's advantage not to waste punishment on those for whom it can never act as a deterrent. This utilitarian logic is one of the justifications for the insanity defense. It is costly to waste punishment on the truly uninfluenceable. In Trust and Ultimatum Game Experience, the differential neurological and behavioral reactions to defections by known computers as opposed to a perceived human agent suggest that human brains sort the world on precisely this kind of basis. My thesis and sole contention that drug addicts lack the necessary conditions for moral responsibility. First, drug addiction is a disease that addicts cannot control. Alan Leshner. Addiction comes about through an array of neuroadaptive changes, the laying down and strengthening of new memory connections, various circuits of the brain. Those long-lasting brain changes are responsible for the distortions of cognitive and emotional functioning that characterize addicts, particularly including the compulsion to use drugs. That is the essence of addiction. The essence of addiction is it is as if drugs have hijacked the brain's natural motivational control circuits, resulting in drug use becoming the sole or at least the top motivational priority for the individual. Thus, the majority of the biomedical community now considers addiction to be a brain disease. This disease abdicates moral responsibility because, as Justice White argued in Robinson v. California, if it cannot be a crime to have an irresistible irresistible compulsion to use narcotics, I do not see how it can be constitutionally a crime to yield to such a compulsion. Punishing an addict for using drugs convicts addiction under a different name. Second, drug addiction constitutes a state of duress. George Lowenstein writes, individuals will sacrifice almost any quantity of goods not associated with a visceral factor for even a small amount of associated goods, a pattern that is most dramatically evident in the behavior of drug addicts. Eliminating behavior that interferes with drug use leads to a kind of tunnel vision on the part of the addict. Cocaine addicts report that virtually all thoughts are focused on cocaine during binges. Nourishment, sleep, money, loved ones, responsibility, and survival lose all significance in economic problems. The marginal rate of substitution between goods associated with the visceral factor and goods that are not so becomes infinitesimal. Third, drug addicts lack sanity. Michael Corrado. Addicts have a distorted view of what is important is that if in fact the addict's worldview is badly distorted and addiction may be a kind of insanity, the addict, like the legally insane person, is not really in a position to appreciate the consequences of his actions. Addiction is a cause of behavior, but it is not because of this fact that addiction to operate as compulsion, therefore provide an excuse. Rather, addictions can be compulsion because they make it difficult to do what the law demands. Fourth, the steps toward drug addictions are not acts of free will. Remy Cadoret et al. In a sample of 242 male and 201 female adoptees who had been separated at birth from biologic parents, adult adoptee diagnoses of alcohol abuse, drug abuse, and antisocial personality were correlated with biological and environmental factors. 3 etiological relationships with drug abuse were found. 1, drug abuse was highly correlated with antisocial personality, which in turn was predicted from antisocial biologic background. 2, a biologic background of alcohol problems predicted increased drug abuse in adoptees who did not have antisocial personalities. And 3, environmental factors of divorce and psychiatric disturbance in the adopted family were associated with increased drug abuse. A public health approach would avoid these harms of criminal justice because it's non-punitive. More importantly, public health solves for the causal mechanism of rampant drug abuse, addiction. One example is safe injection facilities. Robert Broadhead et al. Within the waiting area, clients gain access to all other services and or amenities an SIF may make available: medical, drug treatment, and counseling services, private consultation, safe sex, injection education, needle exchange, restrooms, showers, and laundry, overnight beds, and other activities. These combined opportunities and experiences create the potential for far greater and more meaningful contact between a health worker and IDU clients than any other type of risk reduction service. Despite obstacles, SIFs appear to provide much better opportunities to interact with active IDUs to help injectors deal with and take responsibility for any number of problems they may be facing.
Ready? Yeah. The affirmative advocacy is that we decriminalize these illegal drugs, but they maintain illegal drugs, correct?
Yeah, plus public health approach.
So there are still penalties for abusing illegal drugs.
It depends on the quantity. So having marijuana at a certain amount, like 1 gram, is usually not a penalty in areas.
But you are defending that, like, if they're violating the law, there will be some type of response to that action.
Not necessarily. Like I just said, at certain quantities, marijuana is decriminalized in the sense that there is no penalty at all. Drugs are not a crime, even though there may be some penalty.
Okay. You concede in the standards analysis that specifically the Wolf card, that there needs to be some type of improvement for them to have moral responsibility, right?
No, it's the mere capacity. It's the capacity for improvement.
So,
in other words, sanity.
Sure. So the moral theory that you are defending is some normative extent which is intended to guide people's own actions.
As opposed to what?
As opposed to a non-normative, which would just be a
yes, my moral theory is normative.
Okay.
That's correct. So
there has to be some type of distinguish between moral and immoral punishment. There has to be some way to guide those people's actions, correct?
What do you mean?
Like there has to always, someone has to be able to get
There has to be a criterion that tells us what's moral and immoral.
Someone has to always be in the immoral.
There doesn't have to be like a moral ombudsman on the top that determines who's moral and immoral.
You concede that any valid moral theory has to accept that you would punish someone eventually.
For certain crimes, yeah, of course.
Okay. So, all right.
And certain crimes and certain people.
Can you explain to me how the last contention, the last argument, the fourth one of the case, the environmental factors, proves that people no longer have the capacity to improve themselves?
Well, it's more preemptive of if you say against the disease view that people are contracting this disease willingly, then the Cadoret et al. Card, that's the fourth in the contention, says that actually it's environmental factors like certain family things like divorce rates that are determining people's.
The Cadoret card is an independent reason why they're not more.
Yeah.
And that's because they no longer have the ability to improve themselves because of those environmental factors which are associated with drugs.
Well, it means that they couldn't have done otherwise than what they did.
Okay. At the top of the affirmative case, you say that you should prefer contractualism for two reasons within the Watson card.
Wallace.
Oh, the Wallace card, sorry.
Yeah.
The first one says that contractualism should be preferred because consequentialism does take into account fairness or other things.
Well, just the diversity of values.
Why do you get to assume that those types of reasons are valid?
Why do I get to assume that fairness and justice are valid?
Yeah.
All I get to assume is that there may be more than one type of good that is a reason for people acting. That's all this assumes, that there are multiple reasons other than pure utility.
How do you reconcile between those goods under a consequentialist framework?
I'm not a consequentialist.
A contractualist framework.
We weigh the burdens placed on one individual and the reasons that person might have to reject that versus the reasons that other people have.
How? Under what standards?
So my standard, for instance, is tracking moral responsibility.
Sure, but how do you, like, why do you get to say that that is a valid reason versus that an invalid?
There's nothing built into contractualism. This
What
is one of the virtues of contractualism.
What diversity of goods exists under tracking moral responsibility?
Responsibility is the most important good under my standard of moral responsibility, but fairness is also a good, justice is a good, liberty is a good, things like that.
Okay, thanks.
All right, help me out. I struggled with flowing that case a little bit. I really need you guys to help me comprehend some of the arguments. My first question to you is, what is the ethical framework that the AC defends? I want the name of it. Yes, sir. Contractualism. Very good. If you know nothing about philosophy before you came into this demo debate and just heard the AC, based on what you heard, can someone explain in one sentence what contractualism means or is? Chris.
It's not based on the way to determine stuff is not based on goods or values or arbitrary values, but rather on fairness and goodness.
Okay, not bad. Let's get a little bit more specific. What card defines contractualism in the AC? Not quite, actually. Scanlon. Scanlon defines what contractualism is. Wallace presents advantages to that approach, but Wallace does not define contractualism. So based on your flow, what do you think the Scanlon card says? Yes, sir.
Contractualism holds people accountable for their actions.
Okay, not bad, but let's be a little bit more precise. Alex.
It's about considering everybody's reasons, like reasonings equally.
Excellent. We're getting much closer. Contractualism is basically that, a system of principles that one cannot reasonably reject. So if one cannot reasonably reject this principle, it's consistent with contractualism. If someone could reasonably reject the principle, then it is inconsistent with contractualism. Very good. Now, I already gestured towards this answer, so think about what I've already said. If Scanlon simply defines what contractualism is, what is the function of Wallace? Not what does it say, what is the function of Wallace? Someone I haven't heard from. Yes, sir. Excellent. Advantages to contractualism, okay? This is the important part. When you guys write your cases, don't just justify your ethical framework. Don't just justify your criterion. Go the next step and present advantages to that criterion. So Scanlon sets up a justification for contractualism. Wallace presents advantages to contractualism. Now, I have a sense of what Ben is going to say for his ethical framework. Can anybody imagine what ethical framework would be different from contractualism that Ben might talk about? Someone I haven't heard from yet. I'm going to start picking on people if you don't raise your hand. Yeah. Consequentialism. That is a brilliant answer. How do you know that? In other words, what is in the Wallace evidence that gives you a reason to believe Jake is anticipating consequentialism? Anyone? Daniel.
He has a bunch of preempts against consequentialism.
Excellent, okay? Big important part here. The Wallace evidence provides two reasons why contractualism is better than consequentialism. Here's the big picture point. When you guys preempt answers, in other words, preempt the responses you expect the other side to make, it should not just be a 1 or 2 sentence spike. It should be a developed argument. And usually that's going to require a lot of analysis or a really good card that presents a lot of analysis. So a take-home lesson from seeing this case is that a good preemptive answer is not 1 or 2 sentences, it's excellent analysis. That's the first big point. Second big point. There is something strategic about this AC that has to do with its flexibility. Does anybody know what I mean by that? In other words, why might this case be strategic? Because it is flexible in some sense. Yes, sir?
Because you can also link in consequentialism.
You don't say. Wallace just said contractualism is better than consequentialism. How could he possibly then link into consequentialism? You're right, but why? The good enough card. What does the good enough card say, Jeremiah?
It says that if the
Okay, they're similar in a lot of respects. Yeah, good enough makes a more specific point. Remember, good enough talks about the insanity defense. Does everybody have that? Yeah.
It says that tracking moral responsibility is also the justification for consequences.
Good. It's not quite the justification for consequentialism, but instead that there's a utilitarian reason why we ought to track moral responsibility. Very good. Now I'm going to push you a little bit, okay? You just told me that there are reasons why contractualism is better than consequentialism. So doesn't that commit you to the view of rejecting consequentialism? In other words, how can you say consequentialism is bad and then link into consequentialism with your case? Isn't that a contradiction? Right here, in the blue shirt, looks like you're nodding up. What's the answer to that question? Sure. So the Wallace card presents some reasons why consequentialism is not good. But then we just said the good enough card provides a reason why the AC can link to consequentialism. My question to you is, isn't it a contradiction to both criticize consequentialism and also say that your AC links to consequentialism?
Yes, yeah.
You think it is?
Yes.
Why?
Because if you say something's bad, it's going back and saying it's good, and it's a contradiction.
Okay, does anyone disagree? Does anyone think it is not a contradiction? Daniel?
Yeah, because he never gives the advantages of utilitarianism, so it's not really like it's not really a contradiction because he never gives like why it's a good thing to use. He just says in case I want to kick framework, I can just go to I can still solve for you.
Okay, very good. If we think about conditional logic, this is not a contradiction. Because he says, if contractualism is true, you should vote aft. But if contractualism is not true, vote aft on the basis of consequentialism. There's nothing contradictory there because it is conditional in the sense that we say, if X is true, then Y. But if X is not true, then Z. But in both cases, Y and Z would be a reason to affirm. Here's my last question. Do you think you could anticipate why Jake has made this type of argument in the AC? In other words, think about writing a smart AC that preempts what negatives are going to be doing. What might Jake have the option of doing in the 1AR? Yeah?
He might be able to accept the negatives framework and still make impacts on their framework.
It's very possible that if he feels he can't win or is at a disadvantage in trying to win contractualism versus consequentialism, that he might kick contractualism, go for the rest of the case arguments that talk about why tracking moral responsibility is good on the basis of consequentialism, and then have a reason to vote aft with the rest of the AC arguments. We'll see what happens.
Is everyone ready? We're going to be starting on the at the Kadorit et al. Card on the affirmative case. Then we're going to move to the negative standard. That's the fourth argument in the affirmative case property. Everyone ready? Starting the Kadorit card on the AC, it proves too much. While it claims only association between environmental or biological factors that are dealing with illegal drugs, these associations always exist for every action people take because biologically, people's genetic makeup determines their predisposition and abilities, and environmentally, the people around you influence what you see as permissible behavior. Thus, Kadorit et al. Proves determinism generally that people do not have any type of free will. This sets up the negative case. Because criminalization of drug abuse severs criminal connections on a gate. It's not indication moral obligation that values morality. All moral enforcement attempts to guide right or wrong action by punishing and preventing perceived violation of the moral rule. Without this enforcement, there would be no pragmatic distinction between moral and immoral action. However, only a punishment that aims to deter is consistent with challenges to free will. Joshua Green and Jonathan Cohen agree. The forward-looking consequentialist approach to punishment works with the problem of free will. Consequentialists are concerned with, or are not concerned with whether anyone is really innocent or guilty in some ultimate sense that might depend on free will, but only with the likely effects of punishment. The retributivist approach by contrast requires free will, and the rejection of hard determinism. Retributives want to to know whether the defendant truly deserves to be punishment, assuming one can deserve to be punished only for action that are free willed. Hard determinism applies that no one really deserves to be punished. Thus, hard determinism combined with retributivism requires the elimination of all punishment, which does not seem reasonable. And remember that he conceded in cross-examination that any valid punishment theory must have a type of punishment for an individual at some point. Thus, you have to accept consequentialism. Thus, since deterrence theory can accept determinism and still introduce the threat of punishment to prevent future violation of the law by those who would otherwise be likely to return to crime based on environmental factors, environmental determinism proves retribution fails. As such, all theories of punishment aim to prevent human suffering between persons. The valid criterion is reducing violence. My thesis and sole contention is that the criminalization of illegal drugs decreases drug consumption, but through price markups and the threat of incarceration. Currently, the criminal justice system has a stranglehold on the drug industry. David Boyum and Peter Reuter explained in 2005. Domestic enforcement makes a major contribution to reducing the consumption of drugs. First, about 90% of the retail value of cocaine and heroin represents price markups. Within the U.S., the retailer handling a gram of cocaine faces a prison sentence that might be 1/4 of that faced by a high-level dealer handling 1,000 grams, so the expected prison time per gram is higher for retailers. Other things being equal, a 50% decline in cocaine prices would double the overall consumption. Second, domestic enforcement also reduces drug consumption by directly lowering demand. Since most drug dealers drug sellers are also buyers, the incarceration of sellers reduces the number of active buyers. Third, some enforcement also lowers demand by threatening buyers with arrest and otherwise making it harder for them to find safe and easily accessible buying opportunities. Moving toward public health at the expense of criminal justice would increase consumption by replacing the threat of multi-year incarceration with minimum fines and leaving drug industries unconstrained. Boyum and Reuter 2 furthers. In every major city, more than half of arrestees test positive for drugs. Criminally active users typically commit offenses several times as frequently during periods of heavy use as during periods of abstinence. Intoxication and addiction can induce violent behavior or otherwise lead to crime by weakening judgment and self-control. Users commit crimes to obtain drug money, partly as a result of competition among dealers, but also because of gun acquisition related to the following. Lastly, involvement in drug use and drug selling can change people's lifestyles and socialize in various ways that make criminal activity more likely. The negative case also turns the affirmative case, even if you accept a type of tracking of moral judgment, because the terminal impact is that people like drug dealers are going to be punishing innocents through the use of crime or resolving peaceful revolutions in a type of violent means. This is a much more important impact back to the affirmative standard, because while these types of criminals have done some activity that means that they are morally responsible to an extent, or have done something that might be considered morally responsible, the innocents, we know that there is no chance that they have done anything wrong or that they are doing anything bad, so the negative case impacts better than to the affirmative standard. Then go to the top of the AC. Off of the Scanlon analysis. First, Green and Cohen summarize determinism. This is the second justification for the negative standard, as well as an answer to contractualism. Determinism is true if the world is such that its current state is completely determined by the laws of physics and the past states of the world. If free will is often said requires the ability to do otherwise, one cannot say I freely have chosen a force beyond my control is sufficient to necessitate the choosing. You have no say whatsoever in the state of the universe before you burst, nor do you have anything to say about the laws of physics. Thus, your sense of yourself and your others having free will is an illusion. This both A, justifies the negative case because it's another justification for determinism, which proves that you can only use consequentialism, and B, it takes out the Scanlon and contractual analysis as well as the moral responsibility, because every action by an individual is unforced or is being forced in a certain way. The free will is some type of illusion, so they can't have any type of valid reasons. Then off of contractualism again. Second, contractualism is irresolvable, so it can't guide action because it reduces to contradictory first premises. For example, debate over abortion, whether the people have a right to life or when life begins, etc. So there's no way in which you can resolve between the reasons of different people. Then off of the Wallace analysis. First, you can group the two responses. First, it begs the question because it claims that these are types of values, or the plurality of values are important without justifying based upon the reasons of other people, so it's inconsistent with its moral theory. But second, this is not inconsistent with consequentialism, because whatever type of value that you accept over the plurality of values, you say you just maximize whatever the value is supposed to be. In the case of tracking moral responsibility, we want to try to maximize that people are not being treated badly in terms of the severity of their harm. Then off of the argument under that says that it's the only valid moral theory because it allows for some type of objective reasons. This is not true, and only in a consequentialism can you universalize reason. Philip Pettit proves. If it's a non-consequential universal prescription that I should instantiate the pattern that the prescription that any person ought to instantiate the same pattern may force me to rise myself because I have equal reason prefer both than I, and any age and action expressed by the right or ought in each case into universalizability blocks me from treating myself as special. Although my initial claim must have been to instantiate the pattern of my own life, I acknowledge the general claims of the pattern when I prescribe general conformity, not just conformity in my own case. Thus, general conformity needs to be promoted, even if that means not instantiating the pattern in my own behavior. So I must embrace consequentialism. This is directly responsive to the word because it says whatever reason you prescribe, you have to apply it in the same way to every type of similarly situated person. Then, of the Watson analysis, you can turn this against me. It shows that the type of tracking in moral theory is inconsistent with contractualism because you determine the punishment theory based upon the reasons of the individuals involved in it, rather than the type of trying to improve those reasons and allowing them to type of to get rid of those types of desires. So we would reject a moral theory based upon improving themselves, since the reasons that people already have are the intrinsic good. But second, there's an assertion there's no reason why we have to value the people who are subject to the criminal justice system. That out the wolf card. First, both determinism cards take it out because it says that whatever the type of improvement is going to be forced by environmental factors, so there's no type of real choice, that type of artificial. But second, this is unverifiable because you would have to know the basis or cognitive processes for an individual, which you can't get inside their head, so you have to adopt the consequences based on the ethic, or an ethics based on the consequences, because that's the only verifiable real-world thing. I'll be outweighing the type of resource disadvantage and proving that they're not morally irresponsible, so there's no reason why the second card on the standard is going to matter. Then has 3 general responses to the cards in the affirmative case. First, you turn against them. It's empirically denied that people cannot change and improve and give up drugs. There's no reason just because they're addicted that they can go to treatment centers or anything in order to give up drugs. This same way punishment should work in the same way. This is the entire premise of a public health system. But second, it's not unique because his type of public health system has punishment too, and this is empirically verified by the situation in Portugal where they had $25 euro fines. And third, if it's true that they're not morally responsible, then there should be no harm to punishing them or no moral deficit. It's the same thing as if a rock doesn't have a cognitive process, that you should be able to say, okay, that a rock can't do anything. It should have no harm if I'm going to punish it even if it's not morally responsible. So even under the AC standard, you would keep the criminalization of marijuana or of drugs generally.
So no one is morally responsible for their actions, right?
Correct.
So
in the way that the AC is talking.
So what's your way of holding people? What's your way of considering people responsible? When am I responsible?
Based upon the legal institution should punish based upon the consequences of reducing further violence or further instances.
So an insane person is considered responsible so long as punishing that person would minimize bad consequences?
I mean, the determinism arguments say that the responsibility of individuals is irrelevant, right? But
I have a question about that. Why does determinism threaten responsibility? Why can't you be responsible if determinism is true?
Because the very theory of moral responsibility, which you say, in which you have to be able to improve yourselves, is taken out by the fact that the environmental factors force you to act in a certain way. It is already predetermined.
So no one could ever improve themselves?
They can improve themselves in the sense of adopting values, but that would only be a result of
the environmental.
Because it's a result of the environmental and physics.
Okay, so if I punch you in the face, I'm not responsible for it, right?
I hope you don't do that.
Yeah, but if I did, I would not be responsible for it, right?
We would punish you if it were to deter.
All right, now
if it were to deter other people from punching others in the face.
Okay, now let's say Mr. Timmons holds a gun to my head and says, "Punch Ben in the face." I'm not responsible. Should I be punished still?
You claim you're not responsible, but that is irrelevant to whether the punishment should happen is when you want to reduce the total number of violations of Mr. Timmons holding guns to people's heads.
So I should be punished even though I didn't do anything wrong. It's not my fault that I hit you, right? Because Mr. Timmons
you want to reduce the amount of guns that are held to people's heads. That is the type of good. That is the reduction. That's why.
Okay.
And that is the premise of that type of moral responsibility.
All right. So the morally right thing to do is to maximize the best consequences, right?
It's to maximize specifically the consequences of reducing violence.
Reducing violence. So let's say I could donate $50 to decrease violence by buying, like a malaria net, which would increase conditions in Africa, right? Instead, I spend my $50 on like 5 meals at Jimmy John's in the course of camp. Have I done something morally wrong?
You've done something morally wrong.
By using my money in a way that's unnecessary and extravagant.
Honestly, the reason why it might be intuitive that you didn't do anything morally wrong is because the causality of you donating things is not very clear that it's actually going to get there, because maybe Jimmy John's is going to be saving those children in Africa. I really don't know how that causal chain works.
Okay, do you have any empirical evidence that drug abuse actually causes violence?
What do you mean actually causes violence?
All right. Why does drug abuse cause violence? Where's your evidence for that?
The evidence comes in the second card of the FOIA card in the negative case, which explains why there are both analytic connections between the use of drugs and violence, as well as that it's been empirically verified because over 50% of those people who are involved in crimes have used drugs.
What is the terminal impact of the negative case?
The terminal impact in the negative case is the difference in the marginal increase in crime.
Okay. Let's say, shoplifting is a crime, right?
Not the crimes that we're talking about.
So what types of
Violent
crimes are? So violent crimes.
Yeah.
So battery, just punching, is a crime, right?
Yeah, and murder is a crime.
Is it legitimate to execute someone who punches someone else, just to deter them from committing that other crime?
To reduce the total number of murders in society.
Well, I'm not talking about just murders. You're talking about violence.
To reduce the total number of punishments that would be used disproportionately, or whatever.
Okay, cool.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, before we talk about the NC, I want to talk about CX, and I want to talk about both CXs kind of at the same time. The big thing I want you guys to see is that neither one of these debaters asked a ton of simple clarification questions. What did they do instead? If you had to describe the type of questions they were asking. Yeah, redemption, right here.
When they're trying to ask questions to set the other one up in the next round so they can make an attack.
Consider yourself redeemed. That is exactly right. They set up arguments for the next rebuttal. If you spend a lot of your cross-examination time simply asking questions of clarification, you have not set much up for the rest of the speech, for the rest of your speeches. Too often, debaters kind of think of CX as something that, you know, it's nice to have, it's kind of a luxury, it's not that important. That is wrong. CX is not a luxury. CX is a huge opportunity for you to advance your arguments in the debate. And if you are not using that 6 minutes to your advantage, you're allowing the better debater on the other side to use that 6 minutes to their advantage. So notice how both debaters, even when they wanted to clarify something, asked a question of clarification that set up another argument. Can someone give me an example of a question that did clarify something, but also set up an argument for the rebuttal? You don't have to be exactly right, because I know no one flowed CX. What's something that was clarified and then set up? Sam? Who's he? Which one?
Sorry, Jake asked Ben about shoplifting, and then Ben clarified that he was only talking about violent crimes.
And what type of argument did that clarification set up? What do you think Jake will use that clarification for in the next speech? You're right. How much? Yeah. Ketzabel.
You made the argument that a violent crime is just like punching someone in the face. Like he was trying to put it on the bench while he tried to commit murder. So like the argument is like you can do such everything that's considered.
Right. So he clarified it in the sense that Ben starts to introduce differences between types of crimes. And then he took that further and he talked about, well, if we're talking about a relatively petty crime like battery, does that justify execution, even if the execution would have a greater deterrent effect than simply incarceration? That's the type of question of clarification that also set up an argument. All right, very good. Let's talk about the NC. Before we get into the arguments themselves, what is the first thing that Ben does? Where does he start? Yeah.
He starts on the AC board.
Wow, he started deep down in the flow of the AC instead of reading his NC. Why would he do that? Ketzabel. Okay, very good. The first thing that Ben looked for is an argument that he felt he might be vulnerable against if he didn't answer it well. But there's another function here too. Daniel.
By saying that, well, the card says that it causes drug addiction and both antisocial behavior. But he's saying that because it's people don't because people are influenced by their environment, other people around them, they don't have free will obviously. So that links it.
Very good. Now I want to ask a specific question about what you flowed. What is the first major claim that Ben makes in advancing this argument? It's kind of the tagline for his answer here. It proves too much. Very good. It proves too much. So notice it think of it this way. Ben starts on the bottom of the AC because he is taking an argument and using it to set up what will be his NC. Is that a turn? Not quite, right? Not quite, but what does it do?
It makes it so that he can use it to further justify determinism.
Exactly. Now it becomes a reason why his NC is true, right? It proves too much. This is an argument for me. Here's the big picture lesson here. Don't be a flow monkey. And what I mean by that is that, the ape that gets up there and instead of thinking about everything, just goes straight down the flow and just talks about the arguments. Bam, 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 bam. Don't be that way. Be much smarter. What you should be doing is thinking about the flow, but only as it pertains to the arguments in the debate. The flow is not intrinsically valuable. The flow is only instrumentally valuable because it aids your understanding of the arguments. And Ben was smart here. He was very positional in the sense that he knew what his case was going to be about, But instead of just getting up and going, okay, NC, AC, straight down the flow, he thought intelligently about the AC position and figured out where he could use a weakness there to set up his case. So if we judge you in practice rounds or if we see your drills, don't always go straight down the flow, because if you are, you're losing valuable opportunities to be a much smarter debater. Next question. The NC itself. What is determinism? Jeremiah.
That somehow like all of our actions are
Okay. And what's an implication of that view? Someone else. Robbie. That we don't have free will. And what's an implication of that? Right here. That we cannot be held morally responsible. Okay? If that's the case, would we say that the NC answers the AC position? Yes, very directly, right? It's not just this floating argument. It very directly answers the AC. Very good. Next thing I want to ask you about. Was Ben's strategy more concentrated with answering the AC standards analysis or the link and impact arguments in the AC? The standards analysis, right? And you notice that because he made more arguments and spent more time on the AC standards analysis. Now, let's think about the last thing we talked about after the AC in the first CX period. What was an advantage of Jake's AC? Jeremiah. It's at least possible that Jake could link it into consequentialism and kick contractualism. Not saying he's definitely going to do this. I really don't know for sure. But if he does, what does that allow him to do? In other words, why is that positive for him? Norby.
Doesn't have to answer the response that Ben put on the standard.
Good. What we want you to think about is this. Every time you make an argument, it trades off with your ability to make another argument. So to be a really strategic debater, you should not just think about what arguments you're making. You should think about, when you make those arguments, what arguments aren't you making? And the reason why that's important is because you always need to think about what is the optimal strategy to take. Don't just throw out any old argument, because you need to think about what is the best set of arguments you can make, because your time is finite. And if that's the case, do you think it's at least possible that Jake could win contractualism? Yeah, of course, right? There's no argument that Ben made that was definitely, decisively true. Right? It's debatable. Jake could get up and spend time defending contractualism. He might win that debate. But just because he could win that debate, does it necessarily mean that that's the optimal strategy? No. So you guys should think about your arguments and strategies flexibly in that way. Don't be closed-minded, and certainly don't take it as an issue of pride, right? You read this argument, you think it's great, you kind of personally believe it. If it gets contested, and there's a better way for you to win, don't be afraid to kick that argument and be a little bit more flexible. Be strategic. Let's see what Jake does.
Negative contention, standards analysis, moving on to the AC. But starting on negative contention. Ready? Turn, criminalization increases violence. 3 warrants. Benson, 2009. Prohibitions are unlikely to create violence unless there is substantial enforcement which have at least 2 impacts that produce increase in violence. First, we can use sellers, move on to other locations where enforcement is less active, resulting in turf wars as they attempt to establish themselves in these new locations. Second, as sellers move, buyers may lose their regular trust sources of drugs. If they search in unfamiliar locations, try to establish contact with unfamiliar sellers, they are even more vulnerable to attack by robbers. Rasmussen et al. Offered an empirical test of this hypothesis. They developed a model of violent crime using a cross-section sample of 279 police jurisdictions. They find that violent crime rate in one jurisdiction is positively and significantly related to the drug arrest rate in adjacent jurisdictions. Furthermore, the responsiveness of violent crime to these enforcement differentials is much larger than the spillovers commonly reported in subsidies in studies of interjurisdictional effects of property crime. Miron 2001 confirms. Brum and Clonger compare homicide defense rates, homicide arrest rates, and drug prohibition arrest rates across cities. Drug prohibition arrest rates are negatively associated with homicide arrest rates, and homicide arrest rates are negatively associated with homicide offense rates, implying that higher drug prohibition arrest rates are associated with higher homicide offense rates. Increased enforcement of drug prohibition takes resources away from deterrence of other criminal activities such as homicide. Miron continues. Across a broad range of specifications, being a drug-producing country or having a high drug possession arrest rate is positively associated with a higher homicide rate. Panel regressions of 5-year average homicide rates obtain a consistently positive relation between the drug production and arrest variables and homicide rates. They obtain a similar result for the drug producer dummy using vital statistics data on homicide rates. You prefer this evidence over the evidence in the negative case because his evidence is one step removed, because he has to say not only that the affirmative increases drug abuse and that increases violence more. I have the direct link back to violence, which is his standard, so I'm impacting more directly back to it. Then he says at the bottom of the negative case that he turns the affirmative case because drug dealers are punishing innocent people, but there is no link to the affirmative case because I make a distinction between punishment and crime. That is one of the problems with the negative case, that he does not distinguish and he conflates punishment and crime. Harming an innocent person on the streets is not the same thing as punishing an innocent person in the criminal justice system, because law reflects our respect for certain norms and values in society. Then, off of the standard Green and Cohen assume that responsibility is incompatible with determinism. I will concede that all things in the world are causally determined by past things. However, I think that is compatible with moral responsibility because of the Wolf card in the affirmative case. So, move on to the affirmative case. Go to Wolf. His first answer to Wolf says that this determinism takes it out because there is no real choice to be sane or to be able to improve ourselves. However, Wolf preempts this argument because it doesn't matter if we don't have a choice on whether we can be sane, because we don't need to be self-creating. We only need to be self-correcting. That is the requirement of Wolf. You can be self-correcting even if determinism isn't true, because just because you don't have a choice on whether you are self-correcting doesn't mean you self-correct. He's going too far in saying what responsibility requires, because agents are morally responsible if they are sane, and only if they are sane. Off his second argument, which says it's unverifiable because we can't get in their heads, this argument goes both ways because he can't get into criminals' heads to know that they are even deterrable in the first place. So extent Wolfer says we don't need to be self-creating. We need more than self-revision, though. We need to be self-correcting, which is why sanity determines moral responsibility. This cuts off Green and Cohen because it means that determinism is perfectly compatible with responsibility. Then go to good enough, which he concedes. I'm going to win because of good enough. Extend good enough, which says that my standard links into utilitarianism strongly because whenever we punish an innocent person, we might waste that punishment on an agent who is not deterrable. That's why we don't punish insane people, because they're not deterrable. They cannot be influenced by reason. This means that my standard is the best impact to consequential, because people who are under duress or insane are not deterrable regardless of whether they are responsible. I am conceding consequentialism, but I am not conceding deterrence because I am proving that my standard is key to consequentialism. Then, off the turn to Watson. Broadhead will solve the turn to Watson because harm reduction, he concedes that harm reduction will lead to this improvement and means that they can take responsibility for their actions. This solves back the internal link there, and it solves the internal link to the NC because it means that once they become responsible, they are moral agents. They can give up crime forever, which means I'm also decreasing drug-related crime. This also solves back the turn in the overview to the affirmative contention, which says that they are not going to change to give up drugs. Off the second argument in the overview of the affirmative contention, he says it's not unique beside punishment, but it's relatively little punishment in the affirmative world, at least compared to the neg world. Off the third argument, which says that they're not morally responsible, so there's no harm to punishment. The harm to punishment is the wasted opportunity cost of deterrence. That is good enough. So I just got to prove they're not morally responsible or insane. Extend Carrata, which he concedes, which says that addicts have a distorted view of what is important because they're committed to the drug. They think that the drug is better than all other things that they previously thought were good. That's why drug addiction makes you insane, basically. And Wolf says that if you are insane, then you cannot be punished. That sanity requirement is necessary to have a consequentially effective criminal justice system, and I'm conceding consequentialism. I have that impact back because of the terms of the affirmative case. I solved the link because of Broadhead's safe injection facility is good, and because Carrata proves they're insane. Thank you.
Okay, be honest with me now. Raise your hand if you're totally lost. Okay, that's okay. That's okay. You're going to figure it out, okay? First question. Was Jake a flow monkey? No, he wasn't. Why not? He's jumping around a lot. Now, for the people who weren't lost, it seems like you were able to follow him. So for those people, probably a little bit more experienced, that's natural. Why were you able to follow him even though he jumped around a lot? The signposting was extremely clear, right? The signposting was extremely clear. So a lot of you seem to think that if I jump around a lot, I'm going to be unclear. No, that doesn't have to be the case. Just make sure you signpost well. And remember, that's good because jumping around means you have better command of the arguments. You can catch your opponent off guard, and you see the round more clearly. Debate is about argument interaction. It is not just about saying the opposite of what the other side said every single time. Which dovetails with the next point. Did Jake answer every argument back that Ben made? No. Did he need to? No. The 2NR still has lots of outs, but at the same time, the 1AR is good because it commits to a strategy. That's huge. If you are AF in these days in LD, and you do not commit to a strategy and go guns blazing on that strategy, you will likely lose a lot of rounds. If you play by the negative's rules and try to answer every argument that the negative throws out there, or get as many arguments answered as you can, you're going to lose. Because the negative has that advantage, and too many judges in LD these days just vote on drops and just vote on extensions. Your best advantage when you are the AF is to not get sucked into that mindset. Do not get sucked into that and exploit your advantage, which is that you're the one who gets to commit to the strategy more easily and more directly in the 1AR, and that's exactly what Jake does. So if we had to describe his strategy in general, what would it be? And for those of you who raised your hands and said you were unclear, really listen to this because I hope this will illuminate the point. If you had to describe Jake's strategy, what was it? Very basically, someone I haven't heard from yet. Help me out here. You don't have to be entirely right. Right here, in the purple. If you had to say something about Jake's strategy, what is it?
He concedes to consequentialism, and then he commits to the arguments that impact action on consequentialism.
Now, why don't you raise your hand? That's a great answer, okay? He concedes consequentialism. He kicks contractualism. Hey, we kind of predicted that, right? I believe you did. Excellent job, okay? He saw into his crystal ball. He saw the flexibility of the app. He did that. And then she's doubly right because she says he commits to a few arguments, okay? What is the basic story of Jake's 1AR? Not just, I accept consequentialism. Okay, that's not a reason to vote AF. Why, if I'm the judge, am I thinking, all right, if I vote AF, this is going to be the story I tell in my RFD? Jeremiah.
He affirmed that people not saying that he had more right to decrease violence in the world.
Okay, the basic story, you're right. The basic story, if I'm thinking I'm going to vote AF at the 1 and the 1AR, is that we need some form of moral responsibility in order to maximize the best consequence. And that means use the public health approach in order to decrease violence. So let's get back to some specific arguments. Look on your NC flow now. Are Jake's arguments primarily defensive or offensive? Offensive. What do you guys mean by that? Their turns, and specifically, what is his story on the NC? Someone I haven't heard from yet? Jalan. What is his story on the NC? No jargon, though. I know he's turning it. What's his story, though? Good. This was when Jake was the fastest. So for those of you who raised your hands at the beginning and you're like, I'm kind of lost, this is all you need to know about the 1AR answer to the NC. Decriminalization decreases violence. And then he read 3 cards. But the basic story is we should decriminalize because that would decrease violence. Good. You guys understand the NC. Now let's understand what's happening with the AC and this standards argument about determinism. Here's my question. Jake concedes consequentialism. Does he concede determinism? False. He does concede determinism. He says determinism is true. But what does he say after that? And I'll give you a hint. It happens, I think, on the first argument to Green and Cohen, and this is how he applies his Wolf arguments that he extends. Yes, sir? Exactly. He says determinism is true, but Ben assumes that is inconsistent or incompatible with free will or moral responsibility. Jake's argument is determinism is true, but it is not incompatible with free will or moral responsibility. So we're not going to get into it now, but if you're interested in this concept, you should research the following term. It's called incompatibilism. Incompatibilism versus compatibilism. And that's the view, and it's going to come up a lot on this topic, about whether or not determinism crowds out the possibility for free will or moral responsibility. Any pressing questions about the 1AR for those of you who raised your hand before hearing the 2NR? Because I want everybody to know the basic story of what's happening here, because it's so far an excellent debate. Any pressing questions? All right. If you're bin, my last question, what do you think is the best option for you? Should you go all in on contractualism is flawed? No, because that's irrelevant now, right? So what should you do? Jalan? But what Jake already conceded that, so that wouldn't be a great strategy either. Daniel?
Just like go with a framework and try and like get rid of the term that's on the about criminalization increasing violence, and try and mitigate his offense with the Eagles thing.
Okay, good. That's all right, but can we add one more thing to it, Farhan?
When that determinism is not consistent.
Yeah, these are the two major issues that I see as a judge in the debate. Ben might take a different strategy, we'll see. But he's got to say something about this compatibilism argument that we just talked about. He's got to, I think, prove that determinism is incompatible with an account of free will or moral responsibility. Or he's going to need to prove that decriminalization increases violence. All right, we'll see what Ben does.
Everyone ready? The only argument that matters is whether criminalization increases violence, because since he's collapsed the debate down to the consequentialist side, the only question is whether the criminalization is going to be increasing the violence. This is because I'll be winning the framework on 3 different levels. The first is whether the compatibility of determinism versus the moral responsibility explained in Wolff. The second is the critical drop in the 1AR of the Pettit analysis that says even if you evaluate it through tracking moral responsibility, why you have to evaluate it at a consequential level, and then winning at the bottom of the negative case that the NC impacts are going to matter to moral responsibility. The third and final way that I'll be disregarding the affirmative case is how it can be used as a normative theory. The problem with Wolff's argument is that it leads to an indeterminate and unverifiable moral conclusion. The only resolution for that is some type of consequentialism. So let's deal with the first layer of the debate. He's conceding determinism, so you can extend Green and Cohn that the only valid moral punishment theory, if you accept determinism, is deterrence, because deterrence is based upon changing the environment for crime to happen rather than reacting to past guilt or innocence. He's trying to be more specific in saying that the Wolff analysis sets the standard for the moral requirement. So we'll go to the application onto the Wolff card and the affirmative case to explain why determinism is going to be taking it out. Off of the first argument that I made on the Wolff argument, he says that it's not a question of whether there are external factors or the environment determines their actions. It's a question of self-correction. But you guys should have been flowing. The Wolff card says specifically that consideration of the fact that the selves who are doing the revising might themselves be either brute products of external forces, made us wonder whether the capacity for self-revision was enough to assure us of responsibility. That is explicit in this Wolff analysis. So if you are conceding that environmental factors are the brute causes and brute external forces for the choice that they are making, then you have to accept some type of a determinism that leads to deterrence. That is the first very clear from the rhetoric of the Wolff analysis that explains why you're going to be accepting some type of deterrence argument. The second reason is because of the Pettit analysis. You could extend Pettit that any type of non-consequentialist or contractual interpretation of Wolff has to concede that all actors who are similarly situated must act similarly, but since sometimes revising yourself might prevent other people from revising themselves, for example, by causing an increase in crime that kills more innocent people, the only way to resolve that conflict between tracking moral responsibility is to accept a consequentialism of how you can revise yourself, of the capabilities to revise yourself. So Pettit reinterprets Wolff in a way that accepts deterrence. You should prefer Pettit over any type of the Wolff analysis, especially because it's contested and because logically it should come before it, because we know that logically the only interpretation of Wolff should conclude that you're accepting the negative case, while there is a chance under the Wolff interpretation, the affirmative Wolff interpretation, that like other people won't revise themselves, or you won't be able to know whether you fully revise yourself, etc. So that's the strongest warrant for the standard. The third and final warrant for the negative standard is the verifiability argument. He just says deterrence is unverifiable because we have no idea actually if these criminals are going to be responding, but that's what the case debate determines. He shouldn't be making these arguments on the negative case about how it's going to increase violence if he didn't believe in that causal claim. So the only thing that is not empirically tested is what these people believe or how they can improve themselves. So that's the third and final reason for why you're accepting the negative standard. The only question is whether the criminalization is going to increase violence. So go to the NC. At this point, the only question is who has the strongest link to accessing the increase in crime. I'll deal with the turns on the negative case first. Now, the Benson analysis makes a couple of claims. The first one, and most important, the strongest one it makes, is that it's going to increase turf wars because the sellers are forced to move locations. But this is not responding to the crux of the argument in the negative case that says these types of criminal organizations are going to be much reduced because you can extend the first one, that high enforcement policies raises drug prices tenfold, so it has a 1/10 of the amount of the type of consumption rate. This is the 1/10 of these criminal organizations having that type of power. The power of the criminal organization is much more important than the type of the ability or instances of the type of turf wars that already always occur, because there's always going to be competition for those types of turf wars. Then, second, you should turn against it because it's going to incentivize these types of nations not to move and cause turf wars, but rather to move away from each other, because the coalitions of drug and international drug trafficking networks is going to just make these type of enforcement agencies be more susceptible and more suspicious. Everyone in the type of network could be responsible for any other person's actions, so they have an incentive to decentralize and avoid these types of turf wars. Then the next claim it makes is that there's some type of empirical analysis about 279 types of districts. But first, this isn't talking about the net amount of violence. It just says violence increases from other counties. But it could be the case that violence vastly decreased in that county. So that type of analysis is inconclusive. Then off the second, the Miron analysis, which says as to the Miron and you can group the Miron and the last analysis that are statistics that explain that it's negatively associated with high arrest rates. First, high arrest rates are not the same thing as having high punishment, a high severity of punishment. The affirmative case still has these drugs as illegal, so the arrest rates are going to be the claim. It's not comparative. But second, you should prefer analytic warrants over these types of empirical warrants, because first, that's because A, that's the only way in which you can bypass the type of correlation without causation claim. These types of statistics claim it's more likely for the claim to be true, rather than actually logically proving why one thing should causally lead to the other. The only way to bypass that is to analytic claims. But third, there are particular problems with these types of empirical analysis. They're from data sets that are talking from like the 70s and the 80s, so they don't take into account intervening factors that my analytics do, like the changes in the arrest rate or gun control laws, or the ability for the Department of Treasury to freeze assets, or all these interesting and new developments that change the effects of these types of criminal organizations, and the increased funding into these types of programs that should reduce the amount of problems. So you re-extend the full argument for the first reason to vote negative is the Boyman-Reuter argument that there's going to be lower, like that they're going to have less power because they're not having the same consumption rate. You extend that intoxication leads to violent behavior, and dealers use violence to resolve conflicts, so that's the impact back to the negative standard. The second reason why this you're going to vote negative is because this is a reason that is linking back to the affirmative standard. The link at the bottom of the negative case is in the same way that drug dealers are resolving peaceful conflicts by punishing those who are not listening to them. That is a punishment. There is no reason why the legal institution matters so long as we're reacting to a basic crime. That is not in any of the warrants for the moral responsibility standard of the AC, so the impacts of the negative case should matter. It should outweigh any type of insanity approach that the AC is taking. Remember to break it down. There were 3 layers in which you're accepting the negative standard. The strongest link back to the negative case is through the analysis and Boyman-Reuter.
Guys, I am impressed. You guys have predicted the 1AR strategy and now the 2NR strategy. What was the 2NR strategy, which is basically what we just talked about? What are the 2 issues Ben was going to have to control? What's number 1? He's going to have to deal with the compatibilism argument. And where did he begin his 2NR? Pretty much on that issue, right? And what's the second issue he was going to have to control? Yeah. Yes, the debate over whether or not decriminalization increases or decreases violence, or, you know, in some cases, crime, right? And crime is your internal link to violence. Very good. All right, so here's my first big question. At the beginning of his speech, Ben doesn't actually extend many arguments for the first 30 seconds or so, right? He doesn't extend any arguments. In fact, he doesn't even specifically get into the nuances of a bunch of arguments. Didn't he waste all that time? No? For those of you shaking your head, why wasn't that a waste of time? Sam, I saw you shaking your head.
It gives us a clear picture where he's going to go in his rebuttal, especially in a round with this much going on. He let us know what his strategy is going to be, and when we actually are flowing those arguments, to know the punch of the argument.
Okay, very good. Some of you are under the mistaken view that any time that you slow up and kind of talk to the judge directly in an overview way is time wasted, that you could be making multiple arguments. You have got to divorce yourself from that view. That view is incorrect. The reason why is there is a difference between real efficiency and nominal efficiency. Nominal efficiency pertains to the number of arguments you can make. Real efficiency pertains to the number of arguments the judge understands. You want to maximize real efficiency, but if you take nominal efficiency too high, what are you going to undercut? Your real efficiency, okay? So the big point is this, and this is especially true for the 2NR, because so many of you give 2NRs where you just try to extend everything the AF dropped, or even worse, extend every argument you made in the previous speech. Slow down. Begin with the 2NR overview where you explain the big issues that are important, the only issues that matter, and preempt the 2AR, which is exactly what Ben does. This introduces a metaphor that I really like, and it would be really good if you guys started to use it. You want to begin your speeches, especially the 2NR, with your head above the flow, above the surface. Okay? You want to make a connection with the judge, you want to slow down a little bit, you want to emphasize big points. You want to provide a decision calculus, so to speak, for the judge. Then, after you've done that, you want to poke your head under the surface of the flow, tunnel down, speed up, and this is where you're executing your arguments in a very technically precise way. You're talking about links, internal links, you're weighing different ways. But don't stay with your head below the surface. After every major argument that you have done, you need to tunnel back up, poke your head above the surface of the flow, and make that connection to the judge and say, this is why it matters. This is why you care. Because if you start with your head above the surface, tunnel down, and then stay underground the whole time, you're going to lose your judge. And it happens with the best judges. They can't flow everything you say. You have to slow down, tunnel up, emphasize your big points, and preempt the 2AR. All right? Very important. The next thing I want to talk about. Ben was neg. A big advantage of the neg is that you can usually make more arguments than the AF throughout the debate. Does he extend every argument he made in the previous speech? No, he does what we call issue selection. He selected the most important issues and really went from them. Can you guys think of a time where he said, this is what Jake is going to try to do in the 2AR, but he's not going to be able to do this? Look at your flow. Did Ben ever do that with one of his arguments? Daniel.
He said that the neg outweighs on the insanity approach. That was like the thing that Jake probably agreed.
Exactly. Until that point in the 2NR, Ben had not directly answered the sanity argument, right? He waits till he gets to this voting issue and then preempts the 2AR by saying, look, Jake might go for the sanity argument, but it's not going to matter because the only thing that matters is what? And it has to do with the NC. Think about his voting issue. The only thing that matters is what? That was the first part of the 2NR too. Consequentialism, but be more specific. Violence, right? The debate on that link term, whether or not decriminalization increases or decreases violence, okay? The last thing I want to talk about before the 2AR. What does Ben do when he's discussing Pettit and Wolf on the AC? Something we haven't talked about yet, that Jake did earlier in the 1AR2 on one argument. Farhan. Okay, that's true, but does he say one of those cards is better than the other? Yeah.
He points to a contradiction in the Wolf card, but it says that like people won't necessarily change.
Okay, true, but I haven't heard about Pettit yet. Laura.
Compares the two cards and says you prefer Pettit for this number.
He directly compares the two cards. He says, prefer the Pettit evidence on this point. It is better than Wolf, and then he gives multiple reasons why. That is comparing evidence. That is huge. All of you need to be doing that. Because at the end of the day, if you guys don't compare evidence for your judge, guess who's going to do it? The judge. And if you leave it up to the judge, you are just asking for them to intervene.
I will win this debate because only on the affirmative role can we deter violent crime. I'm winning this in the Muron 1 and Muron 2 analysis. So the first affirmative voting issue is that enforcing drug prohibitions increases homicide rates. That is the worst type of violent crime specifically. Let's go to the turnoff Benson. That's the first thing I'm going to deal with. He says this incentivizes crime because it means the drug cartels are going to move away and decentralize. However, he's not controlling uniqueness on the term because he's not proving that drug cartels and criminal organizations are centralized now, so his impact is relatively small, at least smaller than the ones I'm going to go for. Go to the Muron 1 and 2 analysis. He groups them. Off the first argument, which says that the high arrest rate does not equal low punishment, the link is very clear because Boyer and Reuter require high enforcement rates. Otherwise, we're not going to deter drug abusers because they know they're just going to go and get away and they're not going to be punished at all. So if they can get away, then they're not going to be deterred because they have no fear of punishment. So the link is very clear. Now all I got to win is that the empirics outweigh the analytics, and I've won the debate. Off the second argument, which says that analytics outweigh the empirics because they imply causal variables. I have an analytic explanation for the causal variable in Muron 1. That specifically is the sentence that increased enforcement of drug prohibition takes resources away from deterrence of other criminal activities, such as homicide. This explains the empirical analysis of Muron 1, which is the Brum and Cloninger study, which says that drug prohibition arrest rates are negatively associated with homicide arrest rates, and homicide arrest rates are negatively associated with homicide offense rates, implying that higher drug prohibition arrest rates are associated with higher homicide offense rates. I'm winning this argument. Off the third argument, which says that the data sets are from the 70s and the 80s, that's fine because they're also from the 90s as well. It's an analysis comprehensively. The fact is he has no analysis from any time period whatsoever. And in the absence of statistical certainty about anything in the world, the best we have are trends, and causal explanations for those trends is exactly what I'm offering. That's with the Muron 2 analysis, which is controlling many variables. He says I'm not controlling for gun control, things like that. Actually, gun control is specifically is a specific control variable in the Muron study. Across all these specifications, being a drug-producing country having a high drug possession arrest rate is possibly associated with a higher homicide rate. Panel regressions of 5-year average homicide rates obtain a consistently positive relation between the drug production, arrest variables, and homicide rates. So this outweighs the negative case in his evidence because A, his arguments are always one step removed because he's going to have to link specifically to drug abuse and then say drug abuse increases crime. I'm linking directly to homicide, so directly back to his standard. B, because mine is specific to homicide, which is the worst violent crime. His impact evidence never says exactly what types of crimes he's deterring. And then C, because at the very least I'm proving a correlation that says that his prediction is empirically denied by the trends that have occurred in the real world. Then the second affirmative voting issue is that if I prove that addicts are insane, then I'm winning deterrence. I will concede Petta. I'm conceding I'm losing Wolf, even though I think his interpretation of Wolf isn't true. I'm going to prove that if we waste punishment on insane people, then we're not deterring other people, which is more important. This is good enough. He completely concedes good enough, which I extend in my last speech. Extend good enough, which says that my standard is impacting consequentialism and deterrence because people who are under duress or people who are insane are not influenceable by rational reasons, i.e. the reason that you should fear crime, which means that there's an opportunity cost to punishing people who are insane. Now I'm going to win that people who are addicted to drugs are insane. That's Corrado. He concedes that the drug addicts have a distorted view of what is important. That means that I'm meeting the good enough card because it proves that affirming will punish someone who is not responsive to reasons, thereby wasting punishment when we should be deterring other things such as homicide. This is why it jives so well with the Muron 1 analysis about deterring homicide. I'm solving the internal link back to this through the broadhead card, which says that safe injection facilities, harm reduction will allow them to take responsibility so they no longer have to resort to crime.
Okay, I want to talk about a few things, and then we're going to recap. Number one, what does the 2AR basically boil down to? How many of those issues did the 1AR go for? No, the 1AR. How many issues did the 1AR really go for? And we said, remember, Ben's going to have to deal with these two issues to have a chance? Yeah.
They went for the 1AR, they went for the deterrent, and they also went for the it's not compatible.
Okay, the 1AR went for the determinism argument, and this link turned to the NC, right? What does the 2AR do? Jalon.
2AR goes for
Speak up.
The 2AR goes for decriminalization, decrease of violence, and it goes for the vet, and it goes to the standard links into deterrence.
Okay, yes, but more fundamentally, the 2AR collapses even further, right? The AC has a bunch of arguments. The 1AR basically goes for two issues. Now the 2AR basically goes for one issue. The point is, this is a huge advantage for the affirmative because now you have a lot more time and the last opportunity to speak on one key issue. If you say this is all the debate comes down to and you have all 3 minutes geared towards that issue and there's no 3R, you have a huge advantage. Now guys, be honest with yourselves. Think about most of your 2ARs. Do you collapse to that degree? No. Lots of you play to the strengths of the negative because you try to go for a bunch of different issues. Now, I am not saying every 2AR should just have one voting issue or one big argument. That's not what I'm saying. Sometimes you're going to have multiple ones. I get that. My point is, your arguments should get increasingly narrow and more developed as the debate goes on. Because that's the advantage of the affirmative. And this gets back to something we were talking about in the 1AR. Would we say Jake committed or not? Definitely, right? If he boils down to one issue, that's full commitment. Would we say Ben committed to a strategy? Definitely. He had even more arguments in his first negative speech than the AC had, and he ultimately only went for 2 arguments in the 2&R. Don't be afraid to commit. Now, given that they both committed, what did they do a lot of in the 2&R and the 2AR with respect to arguments? Weighing, right? Lots of weighing, lots of reasons to prefer the strength of warrants, the strength of cards, the size of impacts, the probability of impacts. Everyone needs to do that. The last thing that I want to point out that Ben and Jake did an excellent job of in this debate and always did when they debated during their careers. They were extremely dominant rhetorically. Both of them acted as if they were totally convinced they were winning the debate. And a lot of you might think, yeah, that's nice polish, but that doesn't really get you anywhere in debate rounds. Debates all the time are determined by who shows more conviction, who looks more dominant. Even in front of the most technically oriented judge in the country, how dominant you are about an issue or an argument or a card oftentimes determines whether or not the judge thinks you won that argument. Okay, so let's recap all of this. You might be thinking to yourself, this was kind of interesting, it was cool to see the debate, I learned a few things, but I don't have anything really practical to apply from this demo debate. Absolutely not. You have a list of 10 things that you can apply, and I imagine your lab leaders might, test you on this, drill you on this. I mean, who knows? Who knows what they might do, all right? Think about the things we talked about. Number 1, you always want reasons to prefer your standard. Not just reasons why your standard is true or good, but reasons why your standard or your ethical framework is better than the other side's. You need to be comparative. Number 2, in all of your arguments that you write in case, and all of the arguments you make throughout the debate, you need to preempt the arguments on the other side. Anticipate the strongest objections to your arguments and preempt them. Remember, a good preempt is not a 1 or 2 sentence fight. It is a well thought out strategy or really well developed piece of analysis, whether that's a card or not. And this type of preemption means that you can be flexible because you don't have to go for everything. So number 2 is preemption and flexibility. Number 3, don't be a flow monkey. Don't be a flow monkey. If you go straight down each flows, you're probably doing something wrong. Because that's not how arguments are developed in debate. Don't be afraid to jump around, but make sure that you signpost clearly. Number 4, use cross-examination to set up arguments in the rebuttal. If you are spending most of your time simply clarifying arguments, you are wasting valuable time that could determine the debate. Number 5, commit to a strategy, whether you're aft or negative. If you take the shotgun approach and throw out as many arguments as you can, kind of see what sticks, and try to go for everything, you will be behind against a good debater. That level of commitment is what is required to really make that next step. Number 6, use overviews at the beginning of the 2&R and the 2AR to frame the judge's decision. You need to package your arguments well. It doesn't waste time. It is absolutely valuable because essentially that's the time where you tell the judge how to write their ballot. Number 7, compare evidence. Don't leave it up to the judge. Number 8, when you start, have your head above the flow. Make a connection with the judge, emphasize a point, tunnel down, be technically proficient when you're underground, tunnel back up, make that connection, tunnel back down, etc., etc. But the point is this, tunnel up and down. If your head's always above the surface, you're going to get beat because you're not technically proficient. If your head's always below the surface, you're going to get beat because you're not telling a story and being big picture. Which brings me to the following formula. Technical proficiency plus positional focus equals great debater. If you're only one of those things, you're not a great debater yet. And those things are not mutually exclusive, they are mutually reinforcing. Number 9, weigh your arguments. Weigh your arguments. It is not just weighing impacts. It is weighing warrants. It is weighing cards. It is weighing standards. Everything in debate should be about a comparison. And you can't compare arguments, issues, impacts, what have you, without weighing. And finally, number 10, be dominant. Be dominant. You act like you are winning every argument you go for. It doesn't matter the reputation of the debater on the side. If you act like you're winning and you're explaining to the judge why you're winning, you will win if you have the right arguments. Don't be afraid. All of you can be the best in the country and beat the best in the country in any given situation. Any questions for our debaters? Let's give them one more round of applause.